Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm very grateful for this turnout on part 2 of our Directors Summit roundtable. And this is our 4th convening of museum directors at EXPO, and never have these meetings been more important than now. It's a testament to EXPO Chicago that it provides a platform for such meaningful dialogues, and I do want to acknowledge that we have about 8 of our alums from the prior 3 director summits here, and which is very heartwarming because it feels as if this program is building a community that is essential, especially now as we are facing the headwinds, and it's important for us to support each other. So in today's discussions, panelists will present recent initiatives and share their perspectives and experiences reflecting the unique challenges and opportunities that museum leadership is facing in a moment of dramatic change. In a time of increasing polarization, cultural leaders have asserted the role of museums as open, civic hubs designed to heal past histories, protect against present threats, support the creative process, and engage communities in transformative life experiences. Accordingly, in our exchange to establish an overarching theme for this year's Director Summit roundtables, it was proposed to consider the museum as a living organism, one that serves to heal, protect, connect, and create. That said, even from the time we began our conversations early this year, we have seen strengthened efforts in the United States to control cultural organizations through various measures, including executive orders, the withholding of funds, and to the shutting down of programs. These actions echo nationalist movements taking place in Europe. Increasingly, leadership faces an environment of volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity. Following the presentations, I hope to explore these leadership challenges to the extent that we can, and the role that museums can uniquely play in divisive times. Given the global reach of our panelists for the first time this year, I am eager to hear what parallels can be drawn between those working inside the United States and those outside. So let's begin our presentations and introductions of our panelists. In the order in which they will be presenting, Monetta White is director of the Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco. With over 20 years of experience in civic engagement and entrepreneurship, she has collaborated with numerous nonprofits, donors, and corporations. Myles Russell Cook is the artistic director and CEO of the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in Melbourne. Prior to that, Myles was one of the team of curators who oversaw major contemporary art exhibitions at the National Gallery of Victoria. Welcome, Myles. Welcome, Monetta. And finally, in 2024, Amanda de la Garza was appointed Artistic Deputy Director of the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina, Sofía in Madrid, Spain. Previously, she was the head of visual arts at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and the director of the University Museum of Contemporary Art. Welcome, Amanda. So let's begin. Monetta.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monetta White. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and giving me the opportunity to talk to you about Nexus, which was an initiative led by the museum to have its first San Francisco Bay Area Black Art Week. So today we'll be talking about that initiative and how that got started. First, we looked at what the problem was within the Bay Area, and particularly to us in general. We were hit with the media. We had some issues in San Francisco. Some of you may have remembered the New York Times wrote that San Francisco art scene was struggling and that it wasn't vibrant. We also had media around San Francisco as a no-go city due to its unhoused population, drug scene, as well as public safety. And these are all issues that affected us in the center of downtown San Francisco. We also looked at the disconnect between San Francisco and Oakland, with a shrinking Black population in San Francisco, understanding the audience that we serve, our artists and our Black audience, and San Francisco being a very expensive city. We're looking at how do we connect this region between the East Bay and San Francisco to support our artists. And, sorry, got to do a lot of things up here. And then, of course, the need to uplift our Black artists. There was no platform or celebration to support the Black artists in our community, and we looked at that as an opportunity for MOAD to take the lead on that. Again, with cultural leadership, I'm a native San Franciscan, 3 generations, and so I understand the importance that MOAD has as the responsibility of keeping the Black legacy in the Bay Area, as well as making sure that we are in lead of giving opportunities for community events that support the Black community. Sorry, I'm a little nervous here. We wanted to look at the opportunities that, may I go back here a little bit, guys? You know I'm nervous up here. I also wanted to mention, as a cultural leader, it was important for me to ask myself and my staff, how do we get our community together? And so this is what Nexus came about. So we looked at the opportunity and we looked at the goals of what Nexus could bring. And when we looked at the opportunities, we looked at how do we revitalize San Francisco downtown? How do we connect, the Black art community together and work with our institutions and our galleries between San Francisco and Oakland and position Black artists at the center of the art scene? The goal was to create this Black Art Week, celebrating Black artists. It was also to draw national and international attention and to spark tourism back into the San Francisco Bay Area, and of course to also activate our neighborhoods. We had barriers to that. We had funding limitations. This perception of, coming to the Bay Area was not a good one. And then, of course, the lack of unified voices across the Bay Area between San Francisco and Oakland. And then, of course, how we met the challenge. Actually, if you look at this photo, it was met simply by calling on all of the Black artists and creatives and leaders within the Bay Area and coming together. And this particular picture is great because it talked about how we convened and come together to look at what Nexus could be, what could it look like. And then, of course, it's turning that dialogue into action. We obviously had to absorb the program infrastructure costs. We led the outreach and engagement and strategy throughout Nexus, also building the brand, the social media, the website, and really using a public calendar for all the events that were happening that week. And then that also allowed us to connect all of the artists and organizations across the Bay together. Now, with that being said, what we did is, Nexus that year, we came up with this idea in August, and then it was October. And the timing of that came out of, MOAD doing an upcoming exhibition along with its gala, and then looking at the Bay Area about what other organizations were doing around the community and saying, hey, you know what, you're already doing this week. Why don't you amplify this with us and be part of the Nexus community and really take that all together to promote Nexus and to highlight each of the programs that were already going on. How did it turn out? Well, when you're on the phone and you're calling and you're saying, let's do this, and everybody wanted to support, we had 66 artists and organizations involved. We had film screenings. We had artist talks. There were obviously challenging conversations during that time around Black art and the community, things that were of concern for them. And film screenings, there's a couple of pictures of what was going on that week. Artist studios that were opened where people were to be able to be engaged. What worked and what we learned. We had, major successes. We ended up having really good press around the success of Nexus. We also had really great partnerships and collaborations with our other institutions. And so that actually brought back the momentum of maybe we're onto something and maybe this is going to become an annual thing. Of course, remaining challenges, we needed to have a more robust website. We needed to centralize Nexus as part of a festival-like experience. We also wanted to ensure that our cultural partners were able to participate. So if there was anyone that we left out, we wanted to make sure that they're involved. Of course, addressing the bigger picture that Nexus was trying to address was just keeping the art vibrancy in the San Francisco Bay Area. Obviously, funding for this event, national network, drawing not only just from local artists, but others to come. And then community run. I mean, ideally, Moed is leading it, but we really want it to be a community run led series, along with inclusivity. And then, in closing, Nexus is happening again this year, October 1st through the 5th. And so we hope that all of you guys will come out to join us with this excitement. This is a very big initiative for us, and we're looking forward for you all to show up. Thank you.
Myles. Thank you, Monetta.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So my name is Myles Russell Cook. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge where we are, which is on the lands of the Council of the Fire of Threes, so the Potawatomi, the Ojibwa, and the Ottawa people. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future, and acknowledge that no matter where you are in this country, whether you are standing on carpet, concrete, steel, bitumen, if beneath you there is countless kilometers of coaxial cables and pipes, you are on native land. Wherever you are in this country, you are on native land, and it's to the traditional owners of that land that we must pay our respects. Sovereignty was never ceded. I also want to introduce myself properly because it's polite in all societies around the world to introduce yourself, but for First Peoples, introductions are more than about etiquette, or it's more than a pleasantry. It's an important cultural protocol. It's how we know how we're connected to each other, and it's how we know how we move around in this world and where we come from. And so with that in mind, I introduce myself. My name is Myles, and I come from the northwest part of Victoria in Australia. So my family is Watchabaluk, with ties into the Bass Strait Islands, but I was born and raised on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country and Bunwurrung country, and so I also pay respect to my own elders as well. So I'm in a sort of slightly unique position in that I have just spent the last decade working at the National Gallery in Australia, the National Gallery of Victoria, and in November last year I moved about 100 metres down the road, and I'm now working as the CEO and Artistic Director at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art. And so they're different organisations, but they're very, very close together and they have a shared history. So you can see the top building here. This is the National Gallery of Victoria. It was founded in 1861. It's the oldest art gallery in Australia, and it has as close as you can get to an encyclopedic collection, and certainly the most well-funded gallery in Australia. The gallery that I'm now looking after, the one in the image below, not the most well-funded gallery in Australia, learnt that the hard way, is the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, and it's been running for over 40 years. And we have really different mission statements. So ACCA, where I'm at now, is a non-collecting institution, and the National Gallery of Victoria is really defined by its extraordinary depths of collections. And so I was kind of interested in looking at some initiatives to reflect on the differences in these experiences that I've had of initiatives working in a collection-driven institution and of initiatives now that I'm kind of at the helm of Kunsthal, a true non-collecting Kunsthal. So I've really been passionate throughout my career at looking at absences in museum collections and how we deal with absences. So absence can be anything. We know that institutions have a long history of collections that are disproportionately made up of dead white men. And so how do we go about redressing that and addressing that with collecting strategies going forward? So I thought I would talk to three specific projects that I worked on over the last few years and initiated. So the first was a project in 2017, which was an exhibition called Colony and Frontier Wars. And the exhibition Colony was the largest exhibition of colonial art ever presented in Australia, looking at art made in the country now known as Australia from 1770 to 1861. 1770 being the day that Lieutenant Cook infamously sighted Australia and claimed the lands and waterways of the 250 different Aboriginal language groups that make up Australia in the name of the British. And 1861, the date that the National Gallery was founded. So in kind of looking at this time period, one thing that really bothered me, and I guess would resonate with many people here, because this is not a First Peoples specific problem, was the fact that almost all of the material culture that was made by Indigenous people in that time period was by artists whose names were not recorded. And so we had this kind of myriad of collection objects that were by artist unknown. And artist unknown becomes this kind of homogenous pan identity. And so as a way to challenge that, in a response to this, we took every object from the collection that was made by an artist whose name was not recorded, and we massed them in the middle of the room, changed the labels of all of these objects which were scattered throughout this kind of burial midden to artist once known. And it was a really simple change of language, but it was about shifting the onus of responsibility onto who is responsible for having lost this artist's identity. And so in this instance, it was about talking about the role that the institution played in the loss of that information. We nearly always know the name of the white fella who collected the objects, but we never know the name of the artist who made them. And when we're looking at colonial art, we're really looking at the emergence of European art in Australia, and the only art that is unique to the Australian continent is Indigenous art. And the loss of an artist's name today seems something that would be unthinkable. But of course, that's the reality for most of us working with legacy collections. So as a response to this midden, we also commissioned the woman who you can see in the bottom left here. Her name is Marie Clark. She's a Mari Mari, Yori Yora, Bunurong and Wamba Wamba artist. And she produced a work that was 86 portraits of men and women in mourning from the southeast of Australia. And I'm actually really proud that I was in this photo series that she did. I'm not in the picture, but I'm in the book. And it's really about showing the face of Aboriginal Australia today, and then what's lost. So the antidote to absence being presence. But to follow this kind of thought, it's not only Indigenous identities that have been erased through the priorities of collecting institutions. Of course, there's an amazing work by Kate Just, who's an Australian feminist artist, referencing Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own, where she says, I would warrant a guess that Anonymous was quite often a woman. And we find that particularly with queer stories and with artists from various kind of marginalised communities. So following that, I did this exhibition, which was called Queer, and it was stories from the National Gallery of Victoria collection. And this included artists who were queer, artists who weren't queer, or artists who come from a time where being queer was either not necessary to identify or it was not possible to identify. But the idea was that these stories are embedded and inherent within the collection, and people who are used to looking for themselves and not seeing themselves represented, they would be able to come and look at these other stories in the collection. So an example would be we had an amazing etching of William Shakespeare. It's been on display, 100 times. We've always told the story of Shakespeare. This was our chance to tell the story of Shakespeare's boyfriend. So we had like this amazing opportunity to kind of deep dive, and it was the largest research project we've ever done into the collection. And as you can see, it was activated by the queer community, and I'm pretty sure that the curators were queer cupids, because I saw a lot of winking and hooking up in some of the rooms. I think we were a new beat or something. And then the next project I just wanted to talk to was one of the last projects I did before finishing up, which was the response to the European Salon Gallery. So National Gallery Victoria is really famous for its salon installation, which is kind of, you can see here on the left. And so as a response to that, looking again at the role the institution has played in both eclipsing and erasing, both intentionally and unintentionally, marginalized stories, this was drawing into the collection of bark paintings. So if you don't know what bark paintings are, they are paintings on bark using natural and synthetic pigments, single sheets of eucalyptus tetradonta, and it goes back as far as the 1930s. And before that, these were all customary iconographic designs that would be either painted on the body or painted on cave walls or on bark structures. But there had never been an Australian-specific salon gallery. So this was the Australian salon, and it was looking at this unique medium, which is, again, one of the only art forms unique to the Australian continent. So again, I kind of want to focus on this idea that the antidote to absence is presence. And what does that mean for us in kind of looking at our programming going forward? And so I have been able to do a number of exhibitions where I've looked at named and living artists. We've got the first exhibition by a named Indigenous artist, the first ever exhibition by a living woman shown by the National Gallery Victoria, the first exhibition presented by Indigenous artists in an Australian context, in an international context, the first exhibition that paired an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous artist, and the first permanent collection of Indigenous art. So these are kind of important firsts, but they represent just that, firsts, as part of an ongoing struggle. So realizing change in today's world, it's really, what does this mean as a legacy from moving from a collection into a Kunsthalle? And so I'm really not going to give any examples of this, how this manifests at ACCA, because I feel like I haven't been there long enough. I only started ACCA since November. But these are some of the shows that I've worked on since beginning at ACCA, and I really want this to be a kind of seed for conversation for us as we go into the rest of this panel. I'm getting waved at for being over my 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Myles. Amanda.
Hi, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you so much, Jill, for bringing us together in this moment, which is really important for us to be together and to think together how to move forward. So first of all, I wanted to present to you some images of what is Reina Sofía, which is a major national public museum in Spain. This is the main building, the Sabatini building, which used to be a hospital since 16th century, and it became an art center in the 80s. And it's important to contextualize Reina Sofía, because the Reina Sofía is the museum of democracy. It appeared during the transition between the dictatorship, the almost 60-year dictatorship in Spain after a cruel civil war, and of course, the heart of our collection came afterwards in the 90s with the Guernica as our center and masterpiece, but also as our philosophy, so to speak, in the sense that we stand for the values of democracy, of human rights, and that's very important to say nowadays. And of course, this is a beautiful garden inside the main building, and this is like the extension of the building made by the architect Jean Nouvel. And this is other of our venues. We have two palaces, one the Crystal Palace, that's from the end of 19th century, and the Palacio Velázquez, which is, like a 18th century palace in a park, a major park in the city center that it's called El Retiro, and we are building a new venue in Santander. And I mean, just some data. We have 29,000 artworks in our collection for modern and contemporary art. And we have 600 employees at the museum currently, and around 84,000 square meters. So it's a major infrastructure. So how can you create change of a major infrastructure in that sense? A museum that has a heavy weight because it's a national museum, and also that has in its collection some of the major artworks. And in that sense, I'm pretty new to the position, nearly a year, and my boss, Manuel Segade, the general director of Reina Sofía, has been there for 1 year and a half. So we have been thinking a lot of how can we create change within. So the first thing, which might be a little bit more dry than speaking about some of the projects, but created a new working structure. And that was, for us, really important, and it's to create a structure that is based on the notion of interdependence. And this notion of interdependence means that we have to work together and change the work culture of the museum. And this museum had before only the artistic directorship and the managing directorship. So now it's created in a very different way. For example, the creation of the directorship of studies, and that it's in constant communication with the artistic direction. And this is because we think interdependence as a program, a methodology, and a structure. And in that sense, how does artistic practice can modify the objectives of the institution? I think more and more we have to go back to not only art history and our role as a museum of art, with a historical collection, to provide the necessary infrastructure for collecting, for preserving the collection, but rather to create an artistic thinking that is alive. In that sense, we are thinking on how public programming is becoming one of the core missions of the museums, besides the curatorial program and the collections program. And this is the reason why, for us, public programs have become so important, because through public programming linked to study and academic programs, we can develop a series of networks of relationship with communities, and also of contemporary thought that is linked to the museum. So the museum, in that sense, becomes a research institution, not in the sense of the university, but that is creating other types of knowledge, of care, of institutionality. And this is defined by artistic practice and the curatorial research. And in that sense, we are like a place to be, a public space, but also a place of togetherness and a place of joy, which I believe is very important nowadays. And in that sense, that is what art or artistic practice can provide us. So just to show you a very, I'm not gonna go through all that, but our public program activity is developing in how through our public activities we can research on our collection, on our archive, on how, for example, we create a parallel activity to a show, and these activities go after the exhibition or the temporality of the exhibition. In that sense, is how the institution lets the artistic practice to drive its program, rather than being just the curatorial or the main institutional objectives of the museum. So for us, that is like a big change we're undergoing. So the museum is also a school, space for experimentation, artistic experimentation, place for, as I said, of togetherness, and as I've said before, where we also practice joy. And in that sense, we are very focused in part of our public programming on live arts and time-based art practices. And through different formats, we tried also to understand how these formats produce research about our collection, about conservation, and also about this notion of togetherness. For example, I'll just put a brief example, which is we made There was the 25th anniversary of a collection of LPs, of vinyls, of Caribbean music that are very influenced, and as you know, many of the Caribbean dancing music are very influenced by African rhythms. And in Madrid, for example, the population of Latin American people living in Madrid is 1 million out of the entire 5 million population. So right now, like connecting with this legacy of Latin American population is very important. So we did and we had the anniversary of this collection of Caribbean music and Latin American music, and we did a major ball at the museum for people to be there just to dance and to spend a time together, because we believe that the notion of the museum, of the notion of generative place as the museum as a generative place has changed throughout the decades, and more we have to understand what is our role in society. That means to be a situated institution in time, in history, and in the context we are placed in. And also the importance of networks, international networks, of course, with other institutions, but these networks not always become from a symmetrical point of view. In that sense, for example, me as a Latin American person, being in a directorship position in Europe, which just to say I'm the first brown person to have a directorship position in a Spanish art institution in the history of Spain. And of course I'm Mexican. And this entails, of course, a great responsibility, not just for me, but for my generation, to be aware of the context we live in, and also to make the right choices. For example, how we want to work with other institutions, for example, in Latin America, how we want to acquire, considering the colonial history and the differences in infrastructure. So how we create new models for collecting, for dialoguing in a different sort of conversation with institutions, in a non-extractivist and in a way that we meet each other in a middle point just to move forward and to understand what we can create through culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. That was great visuals. One of the, for me, rewarding parts of moderating this panel and the structure of it is the cultural specificity of the institutions that you speak to, and how each of you have crafted initiatives that are so specific to the histories and the context, and how beautifully you're speaking to the cultural specificity. And so it feels like, this vibrancy of institutions that are really generative and coming out of their communities. But I do think that there's a kind of overarching theme here that I'm interested in, especially with Monetta and Myles. You talked about, in both of your cases, kind of digging into cultural memories that have been, in this case, of from unknown to once known, and in your case, a Black community that has a cultural legacy but has not been given as much of a narrative. And I'm wondering, in the initiatives that you're taking, because you're both these are new initiatives, right? How are you seeing that resurfacing cultural memory? How is it playing out in your visitors and in the people who are coming, and the audiences that you're aspiring to reach? And how are you seeing that changing? And I'm curious, Amanda, how that connects to, I love your phrase of social choreography. So if the point of these exhibitions and initiatives is to be generative of a kind of social gathering of people, how is it playing out? How are you seeing that impacting the visitorship? If you could speak, each of you, to that.
I don't think our audience has ever been more engaged. The audience expects, rightly, so much from the institution, and I think that's a really powerful motivator. I suppose the examples I gave you represent beginnings. We don't use the term once known anymore. on labels, because that was a catalyst for a conversation, and that conversation evolved into appointing an elder in residence and a strategic council of Indigenous advisors, who then reviewed the kind of collection management approach and registration approach and landed on the term artist name not recorded, because Once Known had a really melancholic kind of feeling to it. It was evocative and it was important and it started a conversation, but we actually wanted to position this to still be optimistic and to still be giving Aboriginal people agency to say, well, we are here and we do have, agency over our culture, our community. And so Once Known was too emotive. And so Artist Name Not Recorded was where the advisory group landed on, because it achieved the same goal, which was shifting the responsibility of erasure onto the institution. Somebody didn't write the name down. That's why it's not recorded. It's not that the person didn't have a name. And so it's kind of interesting. Like, I suppose I see, and we got, a whole range of feedback. So many people in the community loved Artist Once Known and loved this initiative, but then we also had a lot of mob who had said that there was something very challenging about it. And so it was the beginning of a conversation. And I think that as kind of change makers within institutional spaces, like within the arts, we're always just beginning a conversation, and then it's about where that goes and how that evolves. Like, doing a show on queer stories from the collection isn't the last time you should tell queer stories in the collection. It's the first time you tell those stories. But we might have told this, this particular story about William Shakespeare 100 times and told the story of his boyfriend once, but that doesn't mean every time you put that work out again, for the rest of that work's life, you have multiple stories that you can tell about it. So I think it's, for me, about using our kind of opportunity with legacy collections to start conversations and then seeing where the community takes them and where people expect them to go. And I love that the community and the audience has never been more engaged. And if you mess something up, so the Australian in me nearly swore, if you mess something up, then the community is going to tell you. And I love that.
I think I heard the question. For us, community is the answer. We listen to, the needs of our community and what they want and what they need. And what we've seen is the trust build up, amongst our artists and our community, them knowing that we're here for them, and we're going to stand for them, and we're going to represent them, and the same with us internally with the staff. We work together. And so, so it's just really about, being there for the community and building that trust.
Well, in the case of Reina Sofía, of course, like, we have always thought, before we arrived there, Manuel and I, that we have publics, different sorts of publics from different backgrounds. We receive a lot of tourists and so on. But we have also a very strong link to grassroots organization. And that's for us like our nearest and neighboring community. One of the panelists yesterday was talking about being a good neighbor, and so we've worked, and so the museum, just to resume, in the museum now, the public or the visitors or the audiences are demanding different things from museum nowadays than just art. Like, they are demanding sometimes contradictory things. But on the other hand, what I was gonna say is that we have, for example, an assembly with grassroots organizations, and where the museum is just one member of the assembly. It's not the leader of the assembly. So in that sense, we are trying since probably 6-7 years to build a relationship of trust with previously organized communities that see the museum as a place that belongs to them. So that's one, I think, of the key questions. how do we make museums spaces of belonging with our audiences in different levels. Not every relationship has to do with the same sort of commitment, but I think we do have in our different scales to be able to generate like a very strong commitment that goes both ways between audiences, communities, networks, and institutions.
I love that. So you all three of you spoke to the importance of trust as a foundation for affecting transformative change. And I'm wondering if we could pivot now to the concept of solidarity among institutions. And this gets us into this moment of weathering storms and how institutions can weather storms. And I know, Monetta, in the Bay Area, that the leadership of San Francisco museums have formed a kind of collaborative statement. And Myles, you shared with me over lunch what's going on with the suppression of the artist at the representing Australia in the Venice Biennale. And to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing these stories,
Yes,
because I'm interested in this idea of solidarity, in how that functions, not just that you're building trust with your community, but how are you using your own solidarity among cultural stakeholders and leadership?
I do feel comfortable talking about it because I was talking to a friend of mine. He's an amazing artist. And I said, I just want to bury my head in the sand. I feel like it's the Wild West. I just want to hide. He said, this is not the time to hide. This is the time to talk. This is the time to speak loudly and to show your solidarity, because art has never been at risk more. So the example Jill's referring to is that in Australia, having won the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale with the extraordinary Archie Moore's installation at the last Venice Biennale, the Creative Australia, which is the federal government body that's responsible for funding the arts, appointed Khaled Sabsadi, who's an extraordinary Middle Eastern artist. His work was then ultimately held up by a kind of right-wing extremist politician in Parliament, and his invitation to be representing Australia at the Venice Biennale was revoked. And all other artists who were in the running to represent have since come out in support, saying either an empty pavilion or Khaled is reinstated. His position on the conflict in Garza was particularly weaponized against him. His position is not complicated. It is that life should be respected and that the indiscriminate bombing of children should be abhorrent to all of us. And I think that's not a particularly complicated position. And it's certainly one that I will also use my platform to advocate for. And yes, he's been revoked and now fundraised he'll still be showing at Venice, but it will be an empty pavilion. And it's really, like, to me, really powerful to think that you can go as a country from winning the Golden Lion to not even being able to agree on an artist because their work is too political. And the work that was being critiqued in this instance was also taken totally out of context. It's just bizarre. The censorship that we're seeing, this kind of era of, I don't know, executive disorder, whatever you want to call it, it's just horrific. We're actually seeing art and artists at greater risk than ever before. So when I hear the word solidarity, I think what it means is I want to go and hide. I want to hide under the covers and I want to turn my phone off, but I've been given a microphone, so I have a responsibility, and that's to use this moment to advocate and show solidarity, because I don't think we've ever, as a community of artists and of art lovers and of curators and people who value freedom of expression, we've never been at greater risk in my life. And so I think this is the time that solidarity means speaking up.
Yeah, I know in the Bay Area, we just put out a public statement with all of the cultural leaders coming together in regards to the recent ILMS funding being terminated. And we put out a statement that museums matter. and the work that we're doing matters. And the statement was pretty much of, asking, to be reinstated, to have that government funding reinstated. And so this was a perfect example of all of us coming together. And I know at MOAD, we're continuing who we are, what we're doing, the community we serve. And, we made a public statement about that as well. And so it's really important for, us to work together and collaborate. And I know that once we did put out that statement, our community came and said, we're here for you, we're going to support you. And so we've seen a lot come out.
Well, I think the Reina Sofía belongs, for example, to the International Committee of Museums of Modern and Contemporary Art, CIMAM, which I'm part of the board of CIMAM, and and I think being organized, and it's very important nowadays, because that's where you can find your peers and talk about what you're experiencing, going through. For example, at CIMAM we have it's called Watch Museum, and we revise cases of political interference into museums and censorship and other things. And we are very, very in that sense very open to have all these conversations, and also because, as you were saying, it is very important to talk and to find spaces to talk, even closed doors or publicly, because sometimes it's not in every case it's the best idea to have all conversations openly. But in that sense, seeking for international networks, not isolating, I think is key at this moment, and speaking up, but speaking up in the right moment and with like a clear strategy where to go to, and how to enable things to move forward in that sense, and not to lose hope. And also in that sense, I believe it's a moment where we're also, I think, how to say, like communities that are demanding a lot from institutions also need to understand that we are allies and we are not against those communities, especially in this right precise moment where we need to be united, because the regression in terms of freedom, of democracy is real, and it's real in every parts of the world, among like economical scarcity and so on. So now at this moment we need also to build alliances with different sort of like cultural agents and communities, and become together in order to preserve what we all want in different ways from the institution.
So as we conclude, I do want to thank my panelists for not only your sincerity and authenticity in speaking about, but your inspired leadership. I'd like to acknowledge the other directors who are part of the Directors Summit who spoke yesterday. We have Laura Caroline de Lara and from the DePaul Art Museum, and Stephanie Hessler from the Swiss Institute in New York, and Guillaume Desange from the Palais Tokyo. I also want to acknowledge the wonderful collaborators here at EXPO Chicago, Megan Foy and Kate Sears-Putowski, without whom none of this would happen. And please join me in, and also I do want to acknowledge Julie Trebo, who is our keynote speaker tomorrow, who represents an essential organization, Artists at Risk, in Coalition, ARC, which is an advocacy and support group for artists globally who are facing particular oppressive circumstances. So thank you, Julie, for your great work. And please join me in thanking this marvelous group of panelists.